Thank you for coming today. Welcome to the City of Tampa's birthday celebration. Tampa became a city on July 15, 1887, and today we are celebrating 132 years of history. We would also like to welcome you to our annual Archives Awareness Week. During this week, local archives come together to present their collections by offering a variety of special programs and exhibits. Our Archives Awareness Week partners have some excellent events planned, and this brochure has a schedule for the week. I hope you will enjoy the festivities. Some of our partners include the Tampa Bay History Center, the Tampa Museum of Art, Hillsborough County Public Library Cooperative, Sacred Hearts Catholic Church, Henry B. Plant Museum, Ybor City Museum, and the Tampa Historical Society. I understand that the festivities started yesterday, and I understand from Jennifer Dietz that it was fantastic at Sacred Hearts Church. Today we will be taking you back in time to catch a glimpse of what Tampa was like 50 years ago in 1969 and 100 years ago in 1919. At the end of the program, you will receive a copy of our brand new publication, Tampa in 1919, which highlights some events that happened a century ago. Before we begin today's program, we would like to recognize all current and former elected officials who are in the audience. Would you please stand? Former and elected officials. Thank you. We would also like to recognize Dr. Walter L. Smith, former president of Florida A&M University. If we have other dignitaries, please stand. Didn't mean to overlook you. I think we're all dignitaries, right? Today, we are privileged to have three very knowledgeable local historians with us who will be sharing details about Tampa's exciting path. We would like to start today's program by welcoming Fred Hearns. Fred was born in the Bronx, New York, and grew up in Tampa, Florida. He worked his way through college as a sports writer for the Florida Sentinel Bulletin newspaper and graduated from the University of South Florida in 1970 with a degree in English journalism. He covered local high school sports and the University of Tampa's football and basketball teams. Fred became sports information director at Southern University in Baton Rouge in 1971 and remained in that position for 4 years. In 1975, he began a 32-year career with the City of Tampa and retired in 2007 as the director of the Department of Community Affairs. Since then, he has owned and operated Fred Hearns Tours, LLC, giving Tampa history tours. They are great, by the way. He holds master's degrees from Springfield College in Human Services and USF in Africana Studies. In the fall of 2019, Fred will enter the doctoral program in the Department of Anthropology at USF. His third book, It's Your Move, was released this summer. Please welcome Fred Hearns.
Well, thank you very much, Shirley, and good afternoon to everyone. I see a lot of green and orange in here, my goodness. Florida A&M University and the University of Tampa made history in many, many ways. The one way that we're going to talk about today that was very special goes back 50 years. Actually, November 29th this year will mark 50 years since a memorable game that made history, not only here in Tampa, not only in Florida, but throughout the United States. It was the first game played in the South between a historically black college and a predominantly white college on a football field. Some of you were at that game. If you were at that game, just raise your hand or stand, and let's give all of us who were there to see that history a hand. I was fortunate enough to be covering that game for the Florida Sentinel Bulletin newspaper, and we have some images we're going to be showing you today. Just before I get into that, though, I do want to recognize, in addition to the Rattlers who are here representing Florida A&M University, do we have anyone here, graduates, former students, former athletes at the University of Tampa? Okay, we did meet with the athletic director and we informed them of this program, so they know about it. It's been quite a while since they've had a football team, but during the time the University of Tampa played football, beginning at Plant Field and then at Phillips Field, and then, of course, at the first new Tampa Stadium, which opened in 1967, that was something to behold, with the likes of the players that they had and the coaches that they had until 1974, when they discontinued the program. It had been said by many coaches that Jake Gaither was a great football coach. Some folk, however, said before 1969, yes, he's a good football coach, but he's a good black football coach. I'm not the only one here who heard that. And there were a lot of coaches, even though Jake Gaither put on these tremendous coaching clinics and had coaches from some of the major colleges and universities throughout the United States to attend the football clinics that he put on in Tallahassee. But even with that, there were some people who were not convinced that African-American coaches and African-American football players could measure up to white coaches and integrated or predominantly white teams. There were several things that happened leading up to that game, and I'm just going to talk about just a few of them. Of course, the great Jake Gaither, who had a career record of 203 losses, 36 defeats, 203 wins. 203 wins. And he'd have had more than 203, but during his coaching career, they only played 10 games a season. Now they played 12, 13 games. 203 wins, 36 losses, and 4 ties. Tremendous record in the Coaching Hall of Fame. In spite of that, there were still some people who had their doubts. Of course, Coach Gaither lived to be 90 years old. He died in Tallahassee, Florida. He did more for race relations, I guarantee you, than anyone else you can name in Florida in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. A lot of it was done behind the scenes. But when Jake Gaither picked up the telephone and called the governor, or called one of the other legislators in Tallahassee, or anybody else for that matter in the state of Florida, things happened. So we know that this man with this great record, and he sent over 40 of his players to the National Football League. Hundreds and hundreds of them got their degrees and went on to become great citizens. But there was yet one thing that he felt that he had to do, and he said that the game that was played on November 29th in Tampa against the University of Tampa with the Florida A&M Rattlers, Jake Gaither said would be the most important game of his life. Now, Shirley's already said that July 15th, which is today, marks the 132nd anniversary of the incorporation of the city of Tampa. 3 months after that, on October 3rd, 1887, we know that the Florida Normal College for Colored Students was founded, 1887. The original plan was to have that school located in Jacksonville, but then the decision was made to open that school in Tallahassee. Now, we know that in 1953, it became Florida Agricultural and Mechanical College, FAMC. My father attended FAMC. Many of you here attended FAMC. And then when Florida A&M University became the name of the school, that was in 1953 when it became Florida A&M University. Florida A&M University began its football program in 1907, the first football team. 1931 was the founding of Tampa Junior College. Tampa did not have a major institution of higher learning beyond high school until 1931, when Tampa Junior College was founded in Tampa Heights in the old Hillsborough High School. The first president of the university was the principal of Hillsborough High School. 2 years later, 1933, that school became University of Tampa. And University of Tampa began playing football shortly after it became a four-year institution. By 1936, those games were played, pardon me, those games were played at what became known as I.W. Phillips Field. Those of you who remember Phillips Field, raise your hand. What wonderful memories we had at Phillips Field. Phillips Field not only hosts the University of Tampa football games, but whenever Florida A&M was in town, they played at Phillips Field. Bethune-Cookman College played at Phillips Field. It also hosted games for the Florida Gators. It hosted games for the University of Miami Hurricanes. The FSU Seminoles played at Phillips Field. And then we had professional football games, exhibition games that were played at Phillips Field. And that happened just prior to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers coming to town. But that all set the stage for what became Tampa Stadium. Phillips Field could only accommodate about 15,000 people, standing room only. But Tampa got a 46,000-seat stadium in 1967 when the Tampa Stadium opened. Several things happened 2 years before that 1969 game between FAMU and Tampa U that set the stage. And had we not had these events in 1967, very doubtful that we would have had that game 2 years later. First of all, June 11th, 1967, 19-year-old Martin Chambers was shot and killed by a police officer in Central Park Village. For the next days, we had a major civil disturbance in Tampa. In the country that year, some sociologists said there were as many as 159 race riots in the United States in 1 year alone, in 1967. And we had a civil disturbance here in Tampa. 2 months after that, Abraham Brown, who was the football coach at Blake High School, decided to take one of his best offensive linemen, who was an all-state blocker at Blake High School, and put him in the backfield and give him the ball. His name was Leon McQuaide, and the rest was history. Leon set all kind of records his senior year at Blake High School, and in 1968, when he graduated, everybody wanted Leon McQuaide. And this was the beginning of the predominantly white coaches wanting to recruit black athletes. Hadn't happened before then in many areas. And here in the state of Florida, University of Miami, a year prior to that, had African Americans on their roster. But it was a private school, as was the University of Tampa. Leon McQuaide wound up attending University of Tampa, and Fran Kersey was his coach. Fran Kersey who had played football at the University of Miami, had been an assistant coach, got a head coaching job at the University of Tampa under 2 conditions. He said, I'll come to Tampa, number 1, if I report only to the president of the university. Second condition, that you allow me to sign African-American athletes, because he wanted to win and he knew he needed black athletes to compete and win. And the first person he attempted to sign, and he was successful in doing so, was Leon McQuaide, out of North Boulevard Homes, a 15-minute walk to the University of Tampa campus. North Boulevard, did I see some applause for North Boulevard? North Boulevard Homes. And so Leon became a Spartan. The other thing that happened, again, we had the construction of the 64,000 seat Tampa Stadium. That made it possible for Kersey to recruit the kind of athletes that he wanted to come to Tampa. Had this beautiful stadium to play in. We didn't yet have an NFL team, but it was on the way. 1967 in December, Sam Bailey, who had been the athletic director at the University of Tampa, who also agreed to step down as football coach, which allowed the university to hire Frank Kersey. And Frank Kersey came in with some innovative ideas, and again, it was he who insisted that they recruit African-American athletes. And we had people in Tampa like, well, there was only one, not people like him, but Tampa had a man named Moses White. Moses White, who was an African-American businessman, owned 4 businesses on Central Avenue. His other business associates voted him the mayor of Central Avenue. And so if you were African-American and you wanted to get something done dealing with the power structure in this city, chances are at some point you call Moses White, and you got Moses on your side. Moses and Jake Gaither were best friends. And Moses and Jake Gaither, working together along with Sam Bailey, the Board of Regents at the University of Tampa, and other city leaders, made the game in Tampa possible. We also know that in 1994, we lost Coach Gaither. Jake Gaither lived to be 90 years old. I believe his home now is a museum right off the campus, Florida A&M University. Leon McQuaide died on November 29th, 1995, exactly 26 years after the game that changed America. Let's see if we can put the first image up. And we have, if I can find it. Okay, there it is. Willie Gallimore, one of the outstanding athletes coached by Jake Gaither, made a great name for himself in the NFL with Chicago Bears. And Coach Jake Gaither, who was his coach at FAMU. Of course, Willie Gallimore was one of many stars in the NFL, Bob Hayes, and there are many others who we could name products of Coach Gaither. And let me see how I advance, because okay. And I'm going to need some help. Jennifer, we need to advance to the next slide.
I think there should be a. You have to scroll. Oh, you do? Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Carrie. You're welcome.
Okay.
Okay, there we go.
And you're moving up. How are we moving up?
You can use that scroll.
Okay.
The arrows here.
Okay, scroll up. Okay, there's Coach Gaither. A year after the University of Tampa played FAMU at Phillips Field, 1 year after, Southern California played the University of Alabama in Birmingham. That was the game that got all the publicity. That was the game that was nationally televised. That was the game where Sam Bam Cunningham and that all-black backfield at Southern Cal beat Bear Bryant and University of Alabama 42-21. And that was the beginning of some real change nationally. But we know that the game in Tampa occurred a year before then. And that was the game here locally that made a difference. This is Fran Kersey, played at the University of Miami, inducted into the Tampa U Hall of Fame in 1983. Coach Kersey is, I believe, 90 years old, and I know he had open heart surgery last year here in Tampa. I'm not sure where he's living now, but Leon McQuaide, and let me show the yellow jacket there. That's when he was playing at Blake High School, and then of course went on to fame at the University of Tampa. Then Leon went to Canada. You know, he played 3 years for Tampa U, set all kinds of records. The NFL then was not taking juniors, so he went to Canada for Toronto, was Rookie of the Year for Toronto his first year there. There's Leon on the right, getting ready to take a handoff with Jim Delgado, who was the quarterback at Tampa U, who played in the NFL also for Miami, and some of the other players there. Leon was inducted into the Tampa U Hall of Fame in 1983, graduated in 1970. This is an ad from the Florida Sentinel Bulletin for that game. The kickoff was 8 o'clock at Tampa Stadium. And look at the price of admission. $5. You could sit on the 50-yard line for $5. $3 upper tier. And then children tickets were only $2. And I was telling Bobby, we were talking the other day about the entertainment after the game. You know, Fort Homer Hesley Armory, that was the largest entertainment venue in Tampa at that time. And it was packed that night. And the headliner was a guy who used to sing lead for the Temptations. Some of you may have heard of David Ruffin. Yes. He was the headliner after the game that night. And oh, what a celebration that was for the Rattlers, right? After that victory. And here's a young man scoring a touchdown, number 10. I think he's here.
Yes, he is.
Steve Scruggs, please stand up. The headline in the St. Pete Times, Steve Scruggs, St. Pete's gift to Rattlers tumbles over. Steve was voted the outstanding offensive player for that game. He passed for 189 yards and 1 touchdown. He rushed for another 111 yards and a touchdown. The Rattler defense pretty much bottled up Leon that night. He did score 2 short touchdowns, but Steve had the longest run of the night, 47 yards. And again, he was voted the outstanding offensive player for the game. And we're so happy Steve is here with us to share this event today. This was the sports page in the Times the day after the game. This game actually took third billing. There was an NFL preseason game coming up the next day at Tampa Stadium, and that was the headline. And then under that was University of Florida game. And actually FAMU, where it says Alls Jake for FAMU for A&M, that game actually shared billing with the FSU game. So we had 4 major sports events on the front page of the sports section, and there's Steve again going across the goal line for the Rattlers. Last year, Steve was inducted into the Florida A&M University Hall of Fame. Yes, sir. And Leon McQuaide, this is his photo from playing days with the Toronto Argonauts, number 24. There's Leon on the sideline with Hank Stram. Leon's last NFL team was the Saints, the New Orleans Saints, 1976. Then Leon retired, moved back to Tampa. He died here again at the much too early age of 45, and Leon is buried here in Tampa, Florida. Fletcher Carr, one of the other first African Americans signed to a scholarship at Tampa U. Outstanding wrestler. He played center for the Spartans. And here's a young man from Palmetto, Willie Lee Jones, played defensive end for Tampa U, Lincoln Memorial High School in Palmetto. And there he is with his coach, Eddie Shannon. And this is our final slide. If it were not for all of the hair and the big smile, because he didn't smile that much, not for the camera, looks just like Leon McQuaide, right? Because it is Leon McQuaide. This is Leon McQuaide III, Leon's grandson who plays for the Kansas City Chiefs in the NFL. This was the game that changed America in many, many ways. We are so happy. I also want to recognize students here from USF, anthropology. You guys raise your hands and let everybody see you. They're all over the room. And we want to thank USF and, again, Florida A&M University, everyone who's here for this celebration. I know there's a reception. Did we talk about that already? We will. Okay, so there's a reception afterwards. Thank you all, and God bless.
Thank you, Fred. We have something for you. Oh,
Thank you so much.
you always have a great presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you all.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Our next speaker, Andrew T. Huse, is an archivist and a librarian at the University of South Florida, Tampa Library Special Collections. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of South Florida in English and History, as well as a master's degrees from the University of South Florida in History and Library Science. Andrew Huse led research on the publication University of South Florida, The First 50 Years. He wrote a book on the centennial history of the Columbia Restaurant in Tampa. His next book on the social history of Tampa is forthcoming from the University Press of Florida. Please welcome Andrew Huse, who will be talking about Prohibition in Tampa.
Do I need to do a switcheroo here, or?
It should be ready, and I think uses this, right? Yeah. Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk about some of Tampa's lesser lights. It doesn't take very long if you start getting interested in Tampa's history that there's a lot of ribbing, there's a lot of laughing into one sleeve, whether you're talking about prohibition, homebrew, things like that. And really, I think when it comes to the early part of Tampa's history, prohibition and some of the laws before it really set the stage, I think, for kind of Tampa's social development for the first half of the 20th century, for better or worse, and usually for worse. So I guess I'll just start with a story, not having the pictures I brought. Right. But the pictures I brought aren't.
It's right there.
Okay. All right, just use this. Thank you. But there is a great story I wanted to share from 1901, and this is for 15 years or so. The sheriff, or the city police rather, had been kind of spasmodically deciding they're going to enforce gambling laws in Tampa. And part of the problem, the chaos, was that the mayor was elected on an annual basis. So the policies of the city could change, take an about face, and they usually did once every year. So the police are, 1 year they're cracking heads and trying to, get like vice under control, and the next they're just going about their business and probably taking payments to look the other way. So, but one of the early stories I want to tell was someone who, you hear a lot about Charlie Wall, a lot, and that's become sort of lazy shorthand for the underground in Tampa. And then there was a lot of other people involved, and so one of the people that you probably haven't heard of is Robert Donaldson. Robert Donaldson was African American, and it apparently, as far as I could tell, it can be difficult to tell when you're from the outside looking in, but that he was sort of picked by the power structure, and the power structure. Some of it existed, in the light of day, and a lot of the power structure in the city existed sort of submerged in the underworld. So he was an appointed African American boss, so to speak, who took care of crime in his area, especially vice and gambling. And he had set up a gambling den in Ybor City, actually. Which tells you a lot about kind of the fluidity of race in Ybor City. But so he set up a gambling den, and it was 1901, and the sheriff decided he was going to clean up Bolita for good. So he started doing all these raids and everything. Well, it just so happened that there was a big strike that year by the cigar workers. And normally the cigar workers were the ones, that was the bread and butter of these gambling places, a lot of these folks. But when they're on strike, that's a different story. They don't want workers like squandering their money trying to gamble, so they might, have a little nest egg to put away during the strike. So the workers demanded that the gambling den be shut down. And what I loved was they actually waited for the police, and when the police didn't come right away, the workers decided they were going to storm this gambling hall themselves. So they started to go in and started to kind of rip up the apparatus, throwing the machines around, and even taking money off the tables. And that's where Donaldson had seen enough. He had a big revolver in his hand, and he started to pistol whip everyone that got close to him. And he held off the workers long enough for the police to show up and stopped an almost riot. But like I said, normally the workers would have been very acquiescent to places like this in their community. But during strikes, that changed. Let's see here. So and I thought I'd show a few pictures too. I didn't want to get too deep into Prohibition because next year we're getting into 1920, right? I don't want to talk all about it. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. Of course, the Latin immigrants changed the face of Tampa really overnight, and. If you talk about there's an original sin to Prohibition, that would be like the Sunday laws. I don't think a lot of people are familiar with the Sunday laws because they were repealed in the 1960s, so a lot of people wouldn't be as familiar with it. But the original Sunday law was in the 1832 Territorial Constitution of Florida, and it carried over to our first Constitution and basically said that you're not allowed to spend money, you're not allowed to make money, you're not allowed to do any kind of trade on Sundays. And that's absolutely nothing. So I think, they had only emergencies, types of things, but otherwise, like you couldn't buy hay for your horse, for example. Now, all these laws work differently depending on what communities you were from in Florida and how things had kind of been worked out, right? So for a lot of sleepy communities, this wasn't even really paid much attention to. Just as long as you, didn't have a baseball game on Sunday. Well, the immigrants here had different ideas. Sunday was the only day that people had off. Most people worked 6 days a week or 5.5 days a week, worked half a day on Saturday. So Sunday was the only day that people actually had off to really recreate. And Tampa's Latin immigrants really took that to heart. That was a day for going out, picnicking, dancing, baseball games, all this stuff. And it's interesting now when we kind of equate football with Sunday. that was a huge no-no back then. Football Sunday, it wasn't happening, not in the South, not then. And what's interesting is I really do want to talk about the years leading up to Prohibition, because I think they're the most overlooked and they're so important to the formation of Tampa. This is a picture of a cafe in Tampa. And what's interesting about the Latin cafe is it's sort of an amorphous thing. I mean, is it a bar? Is it a saloon? Is it a cafe? It can be hard to tell for the outsider, but it's all those things, of course. If you went to Havana at the turn of the century, they said, someone wrote at the time, Havana is a city of cafes. And they're everywhere, and they all sell alcohol as well as coffee. So although they're called cafe, they sold alcohol too. Now, the other thing that's interesting to look at is kind of the relationship with alcohol. If you're an American, it's very different than if you're, straight from Europe or from Latin America. Usually if you're from most of Europe, Latin America, you grow up with wine. It's just a fact of life. Whereas in America, it's this sort of love-hate thing, only until you're 21. And that kind of creates a situation where it becomes this forbidden fruit, and therefore Americans often have a much less healthy relationship with alcohol for these reasons. They used to say that the South would vote itself dry county by county, even if the voters had to stumble to the voting booths to do it, because dry laws, they're not about what you do, it's about what you want other people to do, right? And that's really what it's all about. And to understand, vice, gambling, et cetera, in this town too, is that someone said right around 1900 too, that a white man had never been arrested for gambling in Tampa. Now, that didn't mean that people were not acting a fool, but they weren't getting arrested for it because it was only illegal to gamble if you're poor, basically. It's different sets of standards for different types of citizens, right? So what's so interesting is that, gambling didn't make people upset until we had a lot of white men who would come to visit and were coming to trade and make deals, and they'd lose $3,000 in a night. Some guy would get drunk and lose, several grand, which is a huge amount of money, back at the turn of the century. And then people are saying, hey, wait a minute, someone's getting taken advantage of. It's like, well, no, he went and bet $3,000 at a little hole in the wall. So for a lot of people, considered to be bad PR. But on the other hand, Tampa found itself in a quandary because it was the idea, first of all, making deals, and expanding the city was always the number one priority. I mean, then as now, really, by hook or crook, get an Amazon call center, get whatever you can, right? Whatever breaks you have to give them, right? And that was the trajectory Tampa was always on. And the thought was, if you start to crack down on vice, that these people won't come and spend money in your community. That they're like, well, if we can't have fun while we're here, then what's the point? I'll go to Miami, and I'll bring my business down there. So Tampa was always caught in this thing of, it's got to be a wide open city. That's the terminology was known, wide open. You can do whatever you want. And what's so interesting about looking at the turn of the century rather than starting in the 20s is you really see how this developed at a ground level, and it really begins with just a couple positions of power. One of them being the constable for the Ybor City district. So you had several different districts in town, and people voted for their own constable. Now, how convenient, right? So everyone in Ybor City usually voted for a constable who would be very permissive, a guy who was interested in making a little money on the side, and what he would do is take a payment usually once a week, and that would pay for the week. So you could throw all the bolita you wanted, you could sell all the booze you wanted, you didn't have to close on Sundays, nobody would mess with you. The other guys would get arrested, the ones who didn't pay, right? And this sounds an awful lot like speakeasies and Prohibition, right? So like I said, this is all just training wheels, and it's because you constantly have people in the community who are really vocally, calling out for cleaning up the town. And if there had just been some sort of, a healthy compromise, you could say, maybe all this would have been avoided. But by the 20s, Tampa's known as Little Chicago, the Sin City of the South, and we had a procession of mayors who all really were playing along with that game, and you had to wonder after a certain point. We talked about tourists, we talked about cigars, but the real prize in Tampa was the underground money. Was the money coming out of Bolita and all this other stuff. And if you're not familiar, it's sort of like the recycle sign that we have today. If you want to follow the money, it went from the gamblers to the people holding the games, the mafia, and then if they wanted to launder the money, so they gave it to the police. The police would launder the money, and then it all went right back into the system. And so it's when I say that the city apparatus, much of it was hidden. This is the stuff that was being hidden. So let's do a couple more slides going forward. But this is some people went to Anna Marie Beach, and I just love this picture. It's sort of like the before and after picture. So the before picture, they're four sober gentlemen. The after picture, they're singing discordant harmonies on the beach. You can see Carrie Nation actually came here in 1908. She highly objected to the way that ladies in Tampa acted. They swore and smoked cigarettes. And a lot of it was about immigration and about the fear of the other. German Americans especially bore the brunt of this for late lager beer and things like this. And during World War I, it really came to a head. And I argue that you probably wouldn't have Prohibition if you didn't have World War I at the same time. It certainly drove people to the polls. This is interesting. This is a Prohibition Agents car. I think between 1924 and 26, 6 Prohibition Agents cars were stolen from the city of Tampa. That's the old Columbia restaurant, which was, by the way, one of the roughest places in town. In 1908, City Council wanted to shut down the Columbia because there was constantly beatings, knifings, shootings, and there had been a disemboweling incident in front of the restaurant that year. And so it got to the point where when the police walked by the place, they didn't know, sometimes the people would just be roughhousing, and they go in there and start arresting people, and it's like, oh, they were all just playing around. It was a really rough crowd. It's interesting how things changed. And the other thing that popped up all over the place were drink stands like this. This is an innocent Burger Brothers photo, but really it shows this proliferation of alcohol all over the city, often in the guise of ice cream or soft drink stands, because soft drinks are called that because they're not hard, right? That's how we got the name. And I'm still convinced that there's caches of liquor buried all over. I think the next time, instead of finding tunnels, they'll find we found a lot of hooch. But and of course, the smuggling is out of control, and then a lot of it is actually being brewed here. Anyone care to guess the number one cocktail in Florida during Prohibition? It's not fancy. This is what people in Florida were drinking. It was no wood alcohol kill you. It's corn whiskey with grapefruit juice. Yeah, rough, right? And people, they always want to hear about a fruity cocktail, but that's what people were drinking because that's what they had around, right? And of course, every county had its own sort of moonshine industry, often run and coordinated by the sheriffs, as was Bolita in most counties here in Florida. Oh, and that's in the center, there's Leo Stalnaker. And in my upcoming book, there's a neat story about him, but we don't have time for him today. And actually, I should probably get out of the way and let E.J. take over. But what's interesting is, 100 years ago, Tampa had just gone dry, and the state of Florida had gone dry in 1918. We went dry a little bit before the rest of the country did. And it had taken many, many years and a lot of votes going back and forth to finally go dry. But we were one of I think at one point there was only 2 or 3 wet counties left, and Tampa was one of the very last ones. Hillsborough County was. But we did finally, the whole state went dry in 1918. What's interesting is you'll find, stories all over the state where hotels and restaurants are are using black tablecloths to signify the lost business that they're going to have. But of course, nobody ever lost a dime. Most of those places made way more money than they would have made otherwise because they're selling illegal liquor instead of legal liquor. So it's interesting. And the other thing that I found interesting is when they finally repealed Prohibition, first they made beer legal, and they thought, boy, you know, it's Tampa once again thinking, we're going to cash in, we're going to sell a whole bunch of beer, and nobody bought any beer. Everybody was home brewing by that point, and they were like, oh, the heck with it, you know, unless they had a brand name they really needed to taste again, nobody was rushing to get the beer because, well, you know, Tampans can be self-sufficient in many things. Thanks.
We would like, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
We would like to present you with that, okay? Thank you very much. Let's give him another round of applause. It is now my privilege to introduce the Honorable E.J. Salcines. His legal career spanned more than 50 years, including 16 years as our elected state prosecuting attorney, and culminating in his appointment to Florida's 2nd District Court of Appeal, where he served for a decade. E.J. has 2 academic degrees, including his law degree, as well as 2 honorary doctorate degrees. He has received numerous awards and honors, including 5 awards of merit from the Florida and American Bar Associations. In 1979, he was knighted by King Juan Carlos of Spain, who inducted him into the Royal Order of Queen Isabella. You can also catch him on TV with his popular CTV series, Tampa Untold Stories. We are honored to have him with us here today. Welcome, E.J.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to be with you, but especially sharing the podium with 2 distinguished historians that really know the Tampa history. I was asked to talk about Tampa 100 years ago, and then Shirley said, well, why don't you also tell us what was going on 50 years ago? Well, Andy has done some of that, but Fred has done a superb job. I must tell you that my recollection 50 years ago, right now, we were all glued to our TVs, little screens at that time, because we wanted to know if our astronauts were going to be able to land on the moon. And then how proud we were when we actually saw one of them planting an American flag on the moon. That was going on 50 years ago, and this weekend, our big screen TVs now will be showing you a lot more that we were not able to see in the small little screens that we had back then. So Tampa, 100 years ago, was quite a place to be in. Think a moment. Tampa, 100 years ago, was larger than Miami. That's right, larger than Miami. Our population was just exploding. People were coming down in rinky-dink automobiles, but they were getting here. And our population was just swelling. Our boys, our doughboys, as they were called back then, were arriving slowly, piecemeal. Yes, the treaties of Versailles near Paris, France, had already occurred, but we in the government of the United States had chosen to stay in Europe with an occupational force in case those that signed the treaty changed their mind and the war would start again. So little by little, ships were arriving. Not only were they happy to be home, they didn't realize unintentionally were bringing with them the dreaded influenza. The influenza of 1918, 1919, 100 years ago, the influenza killed more people worldwide than the bullets, the bombs, the bayonets, and the torpedoes of the First World War. Here in Tampa alone, in the Tampa Bay area, 5,000 people died from that influenza. In fact, it got so bad that the funeral director said, "We can't handle all of these deaths. We've run out of coffins." That's how bad the situation was 100 years ago. So it wasn't an epidemic. It was a pandemic worldwide. And you might say, well, didn't they have antibiotics? Didn't they have penicillin? We didn't have any of that for many decades. Every family here in the Tampa Bay area, the greater Tampa Bay area, every family was affected. The Kiwanis Club was just getting founded. It's celebrating their centennial this year. And our Rotary Club, which already celebrated their centennial, was raising money 100 years ago. They had a great idea that really turned out to be a great gift to Tampa. They raised enough money that they erected a memorial, a marble memorial, with the names of all from Hillsborough County that had died in the First World War. By the way, that war was called the War to End All Wars. We now know that that was only wishful thinking. But that monument is still up. And I would urge you, when you are on Kennedy and you just pass Dale Mabry, just west of Dale Mabry, there is a military cemetery there. There is an American Legion Hall called the USS Tampa. There is a big torpedo right in front. You can't miss it. Take the time to park your car and go read the names of all of those from Hillsborough County that died not just in the USS Tampa, but that died in the First World War. The USS Tampa was sunk 7 weeks before the First World War ended, eliminating 131 that were on board, many of them from Tampa. 131 just disappeared with the torpedo that hit that USS Tampa in the Bristol Channel right close to Wales, England. Enough money was raised for that beautiful monument that is there. Enough money was raised to send all of the Gold Star mothers of the boys that had died in the USS Tampa, send them to England, to a chapel in London that unveiled a beautiful plaque with the names of all of those victims of the USS Tampa that sunk right there in the English Channel. The first monument, that's the one that was now moved to where the cemetery is located, it was first put on the corner of Howard and Grand Central, which 100 years ago was called Grand Central, but now we call it Kennedy Boulevard. It was also the start of another great memorial to all that had died in the First World War. It was a road from Tampa all the way across Hillsborough County and into Pinellas County, and it was named Memorial Highway. And then recently, adjacent to Memorial, we have started with the Veterans Expressway, which dovetails what was done 100 years ago. The Rotarians really outdid themselves with a very patriotic ceremony that took place right there in January 1 of 1920, unveiling that beautiful statue. I commend you to visit that American Legion Hall. Don't just go read the names of those inscribed in the marble obelisk. Go inside of the American Legion USS Tampa and go to the back part and look at the gorgeous stained glass window of the USS Tampa with the names in beautiful colors of all that were lost in that USS Tampa. You might also recognize some of the names. Their family members are still around. So between 1919 and 1920, it was a lot easier to travel from Tampa into Pinellas County. And that, of course, was Memorial Highway, and that was a few years before George Gandy built a bridge over the bay so that we could go easier from Tampa over to St. Petersburg. You probably will be surprised to learn that during those 2 years of 1918 and 1919, all Gasparilla festivities had been canceled. But those were interesting periods, interesting century. It was in January of 1919 that local Tampa women, including Kate Jackson, hosted a state meeting calling for women's suffrage, the right that a woman has to vote, urging the U.S. senators in Washington to ratify the 19th Amendment that would give all American women the right to vote. By 1920, all women in every state could vote in the November general election. But it's interesting to note that the Florida legislature was the only one in the nation that took no action on the 19th Amendment. It wasn't until 1969, the same year that you focused on with the great football game, it was that year that the Florida legislature belatedly agreed on the passage of the 19th Amendment. After the First World War, the female look changed, not just in Tampa, but all over. Her appearance was a lot different now after the war than her appearance before the war. Significant changes. In 1920, the ladies started using short sleeve blouses and sandals without stockings. And the dresses got a lot shorter. There was less covering, especially when you'd go to the beach. There, the new bathing suits certainly showed the women 100 years ago were a lot freer, a freer lifestyle with female independence. My judges and lawyers here in Hillsborough County also noticed after the war that something was changing. More women were filing for divorce. It wasn't the men that were filing the lawsuits, it was the women that were filing the lawsuits. And Florida soon got the reputation of being an easy divorce state because the residency requirement had been reduced significantly. So you could get a divorce in Florida a lot faster than you could in Georgia or in Tennessee or elsewhere. And talking about elections, in June of 1920, Tampa saw a major change. For years and years, it had had one form of city government, and then in 1919 they debated, and then they passed in 1920 a new form of city government. That city government was called the Commission Manager System, and it was an experimental type of new government. Well, it didn't last long because by 1927 they had rejected that form, and their longtime mayor, who was no longer the mayor in 1920, namely D.B. McKay, all of a sudden gets reelected, and D.B. McKay goes down in Tampa history as having served our city 13 and a half years in 4 non-consecutive terms. He held that title for a long time. Today, it's the second largest term because Dickie Greco, that most of you know, got elected for 14 and a half years in 4 non-consecutive terms. I told you about the population explosion. Yes, population was growing. The numbers were just, you blinked an eye and more people were here. Again, Tampa was bigger in 1919 and 1920 than Miami, and only California was growing faster than Florida. Tampa's population doubled during the early 1919 and 1920 period. Our population went from 51,608 to 101,162 in just a few years, especially when the independent city of West Tampa was annexed and brought into the city of Tampa, making Tampa the 3rd largest city in the state of Florida. Florida's population went from almost 1 million statewide in 1920 to 1,263,540 in just a 5-year period, 1925, and almost 1,500,000 by 1930. Tampa's greatest legacy is its cigar industry. The cigar industry is the oldest Florida industry. At the dawn of the 20th century, Tampa had become the economic hub of Florida's West Coast. And the cigar-making industry became the economic engine of our city for almost 50 years. It had some 200 cigar factories with many thousands of employees producing a lot of money in wages, increasing bank accounts, and providing human services. You might think of how many cigars were being produced. Well, we were on our way to an all-time high. We know that there are 365 days in the year. How many cigars were being produced in the Tampa cigar factories? 365 million. 1 million cigars a day, including Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. Yet, the salaries of our cigar workers were not going up as fast as the cost of living in Tampa. Everything was more expensive. The cost of living in Tampa was going up and up and up, but the salaries in our cigar factories were not keeping up with all of the expenses. Everything cost more. Factory owners had to meet productions, and the cigar makers were expected to produce more and more cigars. Between 1915 and 1920, the cost of living in Tampa, listen up now, the cost of living in Tampa in that 5-year period, 1915 to 1920, went up 135%. That's a high number. Yet the cigar factory workers, their salaries went up only 12%. That would create agitation and turbulence between the owners of the factory and the workers, between labor and management. As a result, these labor management confrontations resulted in strikes, some that lasted 2 weeks, some that lasted 4 weeks, and some that lasted months. Many of the cigar factories decided, the management decided, we better merge if we are to survive. So, more of the cigar factories merged with other cigar factories, and as a result, their bigger bank accounts and more buying power. But the unions were clamoring that the cigar workers were not getting enough compensation. At the end of 1919, going into 1920, there was a threat really brewing for a major strike. And it happened in April of 1920 with 15,000 cigar workers walking out. 15,000 now were out of work. It was a strike that got nasty. There was violence, but violence was met with more violence. Before you knew it, the so-called self-help vigilantes took the law into their own hands. We're going to teach these radical cigar makers, we're going to teach them a lesson. Unfortunately, some were kidnapped and sent off either to Honduras or put on a train to Jacksonville and told, don't come back. The history books are full of other violence that occurred, including tarring and feathering. It was a bad, nasty, violent scene. All of the industry was suffering. The cigar manufacturers said, I've got to meet all the demands that are coming to us from up north. How do I do that? The invention of cigar-making machines. One cigar-making machine would take the place of 20 cigar workers. More machines came in, and the manufacturers started hiring young ladies to work at those loud machines, making more and more cigars. As the boys were arriving from Europe following the First World War, the cigar industry was hoping and awaiting for the promise of prosperity. But those hopes soon started sinking. More walkouts. And the cigar manufacturers came up with an idea. Well, if we are merging, why don't we buy the sister industry of the cigar boxes? So the cigar manufacturers bought and now were the owners of the cigar box factories. And those factories that were not part of the Cigar Manufacturers Association were told, we're not going to supply you with boxes. So those factories that were producing were threatened, you better get in line and you better agree with us, the manufacturers, or you're not going to be able to sell your products in cigar boxes. It got bad, bad, bad. That 1920 strike that started on the 14th of April went on for 10 months. And the end result was that at the end of the 10 months, those cigar workers knew that they could not accomplish what they wanted, and they had to be submissive and go back as the owners wanted them back, but under their terms. So, after 10 tough months, the strike was over, but the workers had to admit that their strike had not succeeded. It brought a great impact to Tampa, to the economy of Tampa. It brought long-term consequences. Many cigar makers left Tampa for other parts of the country, and some of them said, I'll just have to find another type of job. Some of the cigar makers walked over a couple of miles and went over into the ship building and ship repair industry and were able to feed their families. The cigar factories of Tampa witnessed 23 walkouts. 9 major strikes occurred in 1899. Then in 1901, another strike. Then another strike in 1910. And then the one that I've just described, the 10-month strike in 1920. And then one final devastating strike in 1930. The production that had been up to 365 million cigars a year fell to 227 732,000 cigars. You could tell the significant reduction, and the significant reduction in the production was the significant reduction in the income, in the wages, in the ability to buy bread and milk and the necessities of home. In the meantime, that population was continuing to grow. And Tampa was saying, we need more bridges. So at the end of that 1919-1920, our local political machine started thinking, well, perhaps we need to build, besides Gandhi, perhaps we need a bridge over into those islands that Mr. Davis is dredging and building. And soon the Lafayette, that we now call Kennedy, and then the Platte Street, and the Cass Street, and the 22nd Street Bridge, and then the Columbus Drive Bridge, which used to be called the Michigan Avenue Bridge, and then the Davis Causeway. Ben T. Davis, not the same Davis as the Davis Island. By 1940, there was a reduction in those more than 200 cigar factories. By 1940, we had 115. By 1950, as I'm going to junior high school, 39 cigar factories remained, with only about 7,000 employees, compared to about 13,000 cigar makers back in 1920, 1930. By the end of 1960, as I'm going to law school, over 70% of the cigar force in Tampa had become women. By 1982, only 6 factories remained. Another phenomena had occurred during that 1919-1920 period: the cigarette. It was easy to carry in the pocket, and the cost of that pack of cigarettes was less than a stogie, even though as the machines came in and they were making less and less handmade Cuban tobacco cigars, now you could make, with Connecticut tobacco, you could make a 5-cent stogie. But the cigarettes really took on, and before you knew it, even women were smoking cigarettes. And automobiles became very, very popular. Everybody wanted to have an automobile. So our streetcars were not as full, and people could go from one place to another, and distances started reducing because of the automobile phenomena. And our city fathers had to build more and more streets and roads and highways. As bad as that economic problem that I've described to you in the cigar factory, thank God that during that period, shipbuilding became very important in Tampa, and the phosphate industry blossomed. In 1919, we built the largest ship ever that was built south of Virginia. It was launched right here in Tampa. It was called the Yomochichi, a very large, large ship. In 1916, we had launched the first steamship built in Tampa by the Tampa Foundry and Machine Shop. In 1917, Congress had appropriated $125,000 for more harbor improvement. Thank God for Congress coming through for us, because with all the phosphate that we were mining as heavy as it is, we needed to dredge Tampa Bay so that big ships could come in and take that heavy phosphate out for fertilizing the rest of the world. Tampa shipbuilding continued. Between 1918 and 1920, we built 10 more ships in the Tampa shipyard. We built the Poughkeepsie, a 2,500-ton icebreaker for service out of New York. And there were more than 1,000 ships from 16 countries that sailed in and out of Tampa. Remember, geographically, Tampa is the closest American port to the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal became the gateway for economic expansion worldwide. So, the Port of Tampa really has been an important asset to us, especially when that Panama Canal really got going. It was in late 1919 that word got out that there was going to be a special road built between Tampa and Miami. The cars could now use the so-called Tamiami Trail from Tampa going through Fort Myers and on to Miami. Our bank deposits doubled. Tampa was developing new subdivisions, something called Palmacia, something called Sunset Park, Beach Park, Forest Hills, and the Interbay area, especially when Daddy Gandhi realized his dream of building that bridge over to St. Pete. And a West Tampa banker by the name of Alonzo Cluis had the idea that if he went down to the Lake Kissimmee area and he developed some houses and community down there, that he'd make some money. Not only did he make the money, we now have Cluiston, Florida, because of that West Tampa banker. And Tampa, as you know, with the Prohibition review that you gave us, Tampa became a very important beer brewing area, especially with the Florida Brewing Company. The building is still there. It's now occupied by one of our large law firms. We were even shipping beer to Cuba. That is how much production. So in these short minutes, I've given you a quick overview with my colleagues of what it was like in Tampa 100 years ago. Little did we suspect that in October of 1921, the worst 20th century hurricane that we knew up to that time was going to hit, and that all of Tampa was going to be affected long-term because of that catastrophic hurricane that hit us. Even the shipyard was significantly damaged. That's the way it was 100 years ago. And there is so much more that was happening, and we just don't have the time to tell you all about it today. But we close by saying, happy birthday, Tampa, on this, your 132nd years of success. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you
Excellent,
very, very much.
excellent. Thank you. And happy birthday. Your birthday is coming up too, right? Oh, he stopped counting? Okay. Okay. Thank you. We're almost done. We're almost done. Let's give a round of applause to all of our speakers. We have some refreshments down in the Sister Cities room, but hold a second. I wanted to give a shout out and say a special thank you for our organizers, including Jennifer Dietz of the Archives and Records Division. Also, Allison Smith, thank you, our photographer, and thank you. And members of our city clerk's office, including Sandy Marshall and Suleen Lucas, and the entire team. We have one team, no scene. We do it well. As I mentioned before, we have refreshments down in the Sister Cities room. Feel free to go down and enjoy. It's pretty nice too. So please do that. And I wanted to say a special thanks to City of Tampa TV and the Mayor's Youth Corps. We really appreciate. They always come through for us. We have updated books, City Council books, and we have updated Mayor's books with the current administration. So please feel free to pick up a copy, okay? There are many other great history programs through Archives Awareness Week throughout Tampa, and we hope to see you there. Happy birthday, Tampa. Enjoy your day.